In this clip, we'll learn how to create the base look of our character's shirt by customizing a smart material. All right, great. So in the last clip, we finished up a couple of details, and you can see on my screen here, this is where I've ended up. Hopefully you've gotten a similar result in your project. Now, in moving forward, the shirt is the next step, and we're going to handle kind of the main base of the shirt, primarily the red areas in our character's shirt, if you look at the concept art. Now, right now we have this fill layer. We're going to end up replacing this, but I'm going to come over here to my shelf and I want to drag this down so we can look at both the shelf and the layers panel at the same time. I'm going to come over here to this category called materials. And you can see here there are a number of different materials here. Now, all these materials are very unique and very much meant to be used in a certain scenario. For example, this is fabric from a baseball hat, or at least it was inspired by that. Here is fabric from a knitted sweater. Here is fabric for denim. So if we came in here and we used something like fabric knitted sweater, that looks like it might be a shirt material. Let's just grab this and drag this up and drop it inside of our shirt group. You can see it put it underneath my fill layer, but you can see a really interesting result. Even though it's underneath it, because that fill layer is contributing to normal, we are getting the normal result. So let me just switch them places here. And you can see this really interesting texture that has appeared. Now, notice this material is a single layer in our layer stack. And if we look in the properties panel, you'll notice there are a number of exposed parameters for this particular material. We have channel mapping options, and then we have parameters related to things like the color and the scale and the X and the Y. Now we can come in here and adjust those, and you can see this is basically the U and the V that we're adjusting the scale in. So making these values higher is going to make the texture smaller because it is tiling more times inside the texture space. Now with this material, this is a procedural material. And anytime you're using this on a textured asset, or really any procedural material, you need to be aware of the seams or the texture borders for the area you're applying it to. Now, if we look, the shirt and the outer shells are these two right here. And then the inner shells that really aren't seen are these down here, these small ones. Now, in looking at these don't occupy the entirety of our texture space. So this texture is not being tiled across these seams properly. Now I know that is a little strange, but this is a procedural texture and it's meant to fill the entirety of the texture space. And when that texture space sits next to another texture space, these two will tile seamlessly together. Unfortunately, that's not the case here. And the result here is that we've got some really glaring seams that are visible. And I'll point them out to you with some highlights here in the video. Now, this is something that, because of this, I'm not going to use this material. In fact, I'm going to actually use something a little different, not for this very reason, but for the customization that's available to me. Again, with this material, we can customize only the parameters that have been exposed over here for that layer. Let's delete it. We'll come over here and click the trash can button, and I'm going to come over here and look at the smart materials. Now these materials are very similar at first glance. We have a little different shader geometry that's being used to display the previews of these, but you have things that are very specific and designed based on a certain type of inspiration. For example, this one is called bronze armor. This one's called bronze corroded, and so on and so forth. Now, if we look down here at the fabrics, you can see there are some really nice camouflage fabrics and even some superhero or sci-fi fabrics. But just because this has the name fabric doesn't mean that's what we have to use it for. These smart materials are meant to be starting points. In fact, I'm going to come down here and use one that is actually called plastic used up. And if I scroll down here and find it, there it is. This is what it looks like. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably asking yourself, Eddie, why are you using a plastic material on a fabric shirt? And this is just for illustration purposes. This is how we can take any of these materials and customize them to fit our needs as the texture artist. So we could either drag this smart material up into our layer stack, or we can come over here and click this button and type in the name like I have here and find it and just click on it to add it in. Perfect. So now I'm going to move that back up and kind of consolidate some of my space. And you can see here in my layer stack, we now have a layer group that's been added. So we can see inside this group, there are two different layers. We have a wear layer, which is a fill layer with a mask, and then a base plastic layer, which is a fill layer with something attached to it. Now, is this workflow looking a little similar to what we've done in previous clips? It should. They've established kind of a base, and then they've done some wear on top of that. So let's look at kind of what they've done and begin to tailor it to our needs. So the first thing is the color of this base plastic. I'm going to actually switch that and come in and make that more of a deeper saturated red. Maybe something like that. That fits pretty close to the concept art. Also, I'm going to modify the roughness. Plastic is kind of shiny. It's a lot more shiny than fabric should be. So I'm going to dial that roughness up some. So it looks more like fabric. And we may need to come in and hide this wear layer for right now, just so we can see exactly how the light is reflecting off of that surface. I'm going to go ahead and ramp that up a little bit more. All right, great. So with that done, there is this thing underneath it. And it's going to be a little hard to see with the roughness up that high. But let me just dial that back down so you can sort of see the micro details in this surface. If you look at this, there is kind of this grinded feel to this particular surface, and that is this effect right down here. Now, this effect is a filter, and if I were to hide it, you can see that surface detail goes away. That is the only purpose this filter is serving. And as a matter of fact, if we tap the C key and look at the base color, we have a flat red color right now. So there's no color information coming from this filter. It's just that bump or that normal detail. I'm going to tap the M key again. And let me show you how you can create these. A filter is created in the same way we would add a fill or a levels. It's right here, and I'll just add one. You can see they come in empty, but we can come over here and select whichever one we want. You can see I've filtered it to the same one that they're using as part of this smart material. This matte finish grinded. Now this large refresh symbol just means that the thumbnail hasn't loaded yet. You see this a lot once your Substance Painter projects start to get larger and larger. So this might come up here if I mouse away from it and then mouse back, and there it is. There's our matte finish grinded. Okay, so I'm going to just clear out this field here so I can show you all of the filters. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, things like blurs, sharpens, those are all filters in Photoshop. And those are all filters in Painter as well. You can see here's a blur right here. Here's a directional blur right here. So these things are available as filters. All right, I'm going to get rid of that empty filter and we're going to leave the finish grinded. I actually kind of like that. I'm going to rough that up a little bit more so it looks more like cloth. There we go. Now let's look at this wear layer right here. There's obviously a lot going on here. Now this really is just a fill layer with this white color in it. You can see if we change this to something else, we actually change the color of that. I'm going to undo that with a Control Z because I want to show you that this detail isn't actually created by the fill, it's created by the mask. And if we select that mask, you'll see there is something going on here that we haven't seen yet. Let's select it. This is a generator. This is another feature we haven't touched on yet in Substance Painter. And there are a lot of generators. You create them in the same menu you would create a filter. It's the very top option. While there's not as many generators as there are filters, there are some really neat ones here that you can look at and begin to play with. Let me see if I can get this one to load. There we go. MG Dirt. It's a generator. Now, these generators are very powerful. And this mask, MG Mask Editor, is going to look a little intimidating to you at first. But there are a lot of parameters here for the editor itself. And if I collapse that, you'll notice here that there are some other parameters related to image inputs. And you can see this currently has this grunge paint scratched texture that's plugged into it. And you can see some parameters that are tied to that image input. If I were to come in here and look at this, this is actually going to be this texture here. Grunge paint scratched. Okay. If we scroll down further, there are all of our baked maps, or many of our baked maps. They're also connected to this, so that you can begin to create this very complex, highly customizable mask that's entirely procedural. So again, this is really cool. I would recommend after this video is over, you just kind of poke this MG mask editor with a stick and start playing with it and seeing what some of these different parameters do. For the purpose of our texture, I'm actually going to come over here and maybe drop the opacity down just a little bit so it's not quite as prominent. To maybe something like that. That should work great. Awesome. Now there's a couple things missing for kind of this base red area that I would like to add. And one is going to be the variation in color, the darker and the lighter values. And again, I'm going to do that just like we did in previous clips, using an ambient occlusion mask and even a curvature mask, and apply some darker areas and some lighter areas, again, using fill layers. I'll just create the fill layers now and move them right here. Awesome. I will need to go ahead and mask those really quickly so we can't see them. Okay. Another thing we could do, and we did this on the pants, was we created a layer to customize the roughness. And we actually painted that layer. If I came down here and exposed the pants, it's right here, this roughness layer. I may do something like that with the red areas in the shirt too, just to create a little bit of variation in the roughness. I'd like you to go ahead and do this same thing on your own in between this clip and the next clip. I'd also like you to go ahead and think about the trim for the shirt. Now we haven't created any of the detail for that yet, but I'll go ahead and make a folder and we'll call it trim. But we're going to need a mask for this folder. So go ahead and hand paint a mask that encompasses all of the trim in this shirt. Now the trim in the shirt is around the openings in the neck, the arms, and at the hem. When you come back in the next clip, we'll begin focusing on that trim.